Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone, all the students, all the panelists, all our colleagues for this annual conference of the Chair, Digital Governance and Sovereignty. And I would like especially to thank our partners, Sopra Steria and La Caisse des Dépôts, and also the organizers with Florence Sgel and Pierre Noro. So just as an introduction, I just want to stress that despite the current health crisis, several burning issues concerning the digital world have been also addressed this year, and especially by the European Union. As you may know, a Commission has announced the release of the Digital Service Act package at the end of 2020, and in order to modernize the current legal framework for digital services. And we are now expecting the release of two crucial acts, the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act, that will be released next week. In this case, it is really timely to organize such a prestigious conference with really high-level panelists to discuss both acts, and I really thank Florence, who will be the main organizer of these two panels. And Florence, maybe you might introduce our guest lectures.
Jan, for this very nice welcome. So as you've just said, the reason why we've decided to work on these issues on this precise day is the fact that we've had so many news coming from the EU and related to digital issues over the past few months that it looked like a necessity to work and to address those issues. So as Jan has just said, the Commission has announced the release of a Digital Services Act as soon as June. In last June, this Digital Services Act was announced. You had various consultations that were conducted since then, and now we are currently expecting those two acts, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. So the first panel of this conference will therefore be dedicated to these two texts. We do not have yet many details about them, but this is basically that we will be discussed. And this panel will be moderated. The first panel will be dedicated to the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. And this panel will be moderated by Filippo Lancieri. Filippo Lancieri is from the Stigler Center of the University of Chicago. And I really want to warmly thank him because he helped us organize this event. So this help was very, very much appreciated. Thank you so much, Filippo. And you helped us bring together a panel of world-renowned experts. And I also want to thank very much our panelists for their time today. The second panel will be dedicated to another topical issue, which is the issue of the transfer of personal data of European citizens to third countries, and in particular to the United States. And as a matter of fact, the invalidation of the Privacy Shield by the EU Court of Justice last July has raised the question of the legality of these data transfers. So today, the protection of personal data, especially from American surveillance programs, is raised both in relation to data stored in Europe, to data transferred to the US, but also in relation to data stored in Europe because of the Cloud Act. And the reflection on this subject is currently taking place in a context where we are expecting a new act, the Data Governance Act, that will probably be released as well in the next few days. So here again, for the second panel, we will benefit from the insights of very prestigious international experts. With no further ado, I leave the floor to Filippo, who will moderate the first panel. So Filippo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Florence, and everyone for the invite. So our goal in this panel was not going to be to speculate exactly what's going to be in the DSA. We're going to find out on December 9th. And there have been a lot of panels discussing exactly this. I think if anyone is curious about this, you can Google Alexandre's name and you'll find some 15 panels over the past week or so discussing the content and the variations and different designs. So what we decided to do is to discuss an equally important topic that has received a bit of less attention, which is on enforcement structures and institutional design. So if you want these new laws to have an impact on the ground, you really need to think about how they're going to be enforced before passing them. Otherwise, you might get stuck with this system that is not very well enforced, but is already in place. So to facilitate that, they asked me to provide a very brief overview of the DSA and the DMA for the students in the audience mostly, and then we'll move to our presentation. So as Jan was saying, the Digital Services Act is like this broad package, but it has been kind of divided in two big acts. One is the DSA itself that has a focus on ensuring trust and safety online. And it will kind of impose more responsibility on providers with regard to illegal contents and to like counterfeit products. So though it expected you will have some clear rules on how to do notification about illegal and counterfeit materials, some check seller ID principles, know your business customers, and more transparency around content moderation. And then it is expected that it will have some obligations for large digital platforms, such as they explaining their rank results and allowing users to influence some of these results, and maybe some special audits or things like this. And then what we'll be discussing the most in this first panel is what's now being called the Digital Markets Act, that's focused on preventing digital gatekeepers, that is very large companies, we don't know exactly how this will be defined, from harming competition. But you can assume it's going to be like Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon. And then it's likely to include a blacklist of practices that these companies will not be able to do, that is such as unfair self-preferencing, anti-steering, using business data to compete against these businesses, ability or data access, and then something that's being called the new competition tool, which is mostly a non-liability intervention regime. That is, you will be able to impose remedies on Google on search, for example, even if you did not find that Google had any illegal behavior, but because the commission, after an analysis, believes that the market is too concentrated and deserves remedies. So we're kind of going to take this for granted and try to think, okay, how do we enforce this? How do we turn this into a reality? And then to do this, we have really a terrific panel of academics and people who have been really engaged in policymaking as well. The first speaker is going to be Ioannis Lianos, who is a professor of global competition law and public policy at UCL in London, and also the current president of the Hellenic Competition Commission. We have Alexandre, who is a professor of European law at the University of Namur. He's the co-director of the CRIDS and has been advising a lot of agencies, I think, on this, has been very engaged in the discussion as well. And then finally, we have Bill Kovacic, who's a global competition professor of law and public policy at George Washington. He is a non-executive director at the CMA, and he was in the multiple positions at the FTC and including the chair. So having said this, I will hand it over to Ioannis, who is going to start with an 8 to 10 minute presentation. Ioannis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I actually like to present some ideas about where we're coming from and a little bit set the broader framework. So I think one of the issues that we have been discussing the last couple of years, and we had a plethora of reports. I mean, for those of us that do, those of you actually who do, because we have already done PhD studies. I mean, there's really plenty of food for thought for many PhDs. Many reports have been published, and Filippo has done with a colleague from CRIDS a very, very good survey of all these various reports. So if you read Filippo's report, you basically don't need to read the other reports. And I think one of the problems that we had so far is that the way actually competition is taking place has changed. Competition is not really occurring in the context of standalone product strategies. We see more and more the concept of ecosystem emerging. Competition is done actually through multi-product ecosystems or through multi-actor ecosystems. From that perspective, the perception of the various reports was that the tools that you already have were more focusing on dealing with a competition problem in the context of a relevant market, were not really taking fully. I mean, they could actually be interpreted in a way so as to take this broader perspective, but we're facing difficulties with the way, in particular, provisions concerning bilateral conduct could be implemented in this context. Because the truth of the matter is that we may actually have power coming out of the presence of these various digital platforms at the crossroads of various markets or economic activities that form these ecosystems, without them necessarily holding the dominant position or monopoly power in a relevant market that could possibly serve as a trigger for traditional competition law enforcement. And I think this is really the beginning somehow of our competition law problem. Of course, competition law problem is only a part of the broader problem that the emergence of digital platforms is raising. I mean, we hear a lot about protection of democracy, hate speech, other concerns. So all these actually together with a competition law problem that I identified form this call actually for regulatory action. And the debate that we're really now having, not only in Europe, but also in the United States, and there has been a quite interesting report, and I guess Bill talked about that, done by the Democrats, and you had actually the Republicans, Senator Back, that did another report, I mean, kind of in addition to the report, with somehow the same kind of concerns. And the BRICS also countries have done a report, and I had the pleasure to be coordinating it, also dealing with the same type of concerns. So we are facing now an institutional choice, and I would say more or less, and we'll try to generalize because there are many different dimensions in the various proposals. We have the choice A, which is the choice of using the traditional competition law tool, but trying a little bit to develop it and integrate this ecosystem competition dimension. And I would say one possible way would be provided by the market definition notice, revision of the market definition notice that the European Commission is currently doing, where they could possibly consider that ecosystem could also form a relevant market. It's this notice is quite interesting because it's very broad in the way that the concept of relevant market may be defined. But I think that this proposal will have several problems, and I don't have the time to explain now, but I mean, we have the discussion later, I might. Secondly, there is this idea of moving to some form of ex-ante regulation. I would say this is a little bit a telecom framework narrative. Many of these proposals come from people that have been doing a lot of work in the telecom and regulation of telecoms. In particular, we know that there's a specific regulation concerning firms that hold substantial market power. Here, we don't talk about substantial market power. We talk about the gatekeeper role. And obviously, the very difficult question we need to tackle is gatekeeper to what? Which is the gatekeeper is a nice concept, but actually the ontology of the gatekeeper is still somehow quite unclear. And I would suggest the gatekeeper to ecosystem might be probably a good choice here. And in a way, we will need basically to refocus the debate from the description of the power that these entities have to the field of competition where basically things are happening. And I would say, if we move with this approach, there is a question there about what type of regulation. I mean, what will be the do's and the don'ts, the code of conduct? What will be the institutional framework? I mean, will that be done at the EU level? If it is done at the EU level, will that be DG Comp? Will that be DG Connect? Will that be something between DG Comp and DG Connect? I mean, there has been this very interesting suggestion by Rupert Hodgson and Philip Marsden to have basically this platform complaint team at DG Connect that will be somehow fed by work done by the early alert unit at DG Comp. So somehow a combination of the two. Should we have also something at the national level? Will national regulators be involved? in this context. Which national regulators? Will that be the competition authorities? Will that be, the telecom authorities? We know that the institutional design across Europe is very different. We have countries where we had integrated competition and regulatory authorities. And of course, if we move towards regulation, of course, we have the narrow view of regulation of the competition problem, which is a little bit the telecom fair framework narrative, or we open it up to include also other concerns than the competition law problem, such as hate speech, democracy, etc. So the do's and the don'ts will also not only be inspired by competition law, but all more general problems for social costs, basically, various social costs that these platforms have. So that's the second option. A third option is the so-called participatory antitrust or the bargaining model. The idea is that, well, even if we want to regulate, we can right now more or less determine some don'ts that we think through experience and through the case law that we consider that could be problematic. But we look to the past, but this is a very dynamic economy which really evolves day by day, the different practices, the very much of these practices. So in this case, the information and the knowledge is not really at the hands of regulators. There's not really a body of knowledge that is solid enough to justify some form of regulatory action. So in this case, we will use a bargaining model, and a little bit, that's something also the way that most sectors have been regulated in the US. I mean, the consent decrees, AT&T, IBM, etc. In Europe, we have the emergence of commitment decisions in certain sectors of the economy that basically, somehow take the bargaining model. And there, we can basically bargain. We should have someone powerful at the EU level probably to bargain with these companies. Now, and of course, we have what I will call the enhanced competition law or new tools in competition law type of framework, which somehow adds augmented competition. I don't know, we can find different expressions for that, where actually we are expanding the scope of the competition law tool, considered as a business tort type of tool, which could apply ex post, but also ex nunc. Like, for instance, the German Article 19 of the German Act, which could englobe also, the concept of abuse of economic dependence that could be used. And I think France and Belgium actually have used this concept in the digital sector. Or, what we have been suggesting at the Greek Law Commission to create basically a provision in our law concerning the abuse of a dominant position in the context of an ecosystem of paramount importance. And I can discuss a bit more about this maybe later. So basically taking the concept of ecosystem and somehow, supplementing this to the concept of relevant market in our law. So I think there are many advantages and disadvantages of each of these solutions. I tend to favor the augmented competition law one. For different reasons. I think that the regulatory tool will face difficulties in a very dynamic area where, strategies develop by the day. They are very different digital platforms. You might actually have, quite importantly, the risk of capture if you have a regulatory system that only regulates 5 companies that could be defined as gatekeepers. There's much less that risk in the context of competition law. I would say that in terms of private enforcement, I think that could be very useful because damages actually could be quite a significant element in deterring these platforms to develop basically and behave in a certain, develop strategies and behave in a certain way. And if you take the regulatory approach, basically you do not have the damages. There are obviously risks by having, it's always very difficult to have standalone damages cases in this context, although there do exist standalone damages cases concerning digital platforms, some jurisdictions in Europe, but you can actually have a system of follow-on damages cases. I would say that there are a lot of people say, oh, well, the competition law tools are usually quite slow. I mean, if you look to the way regulators, sector regulators also do their business, I mean, that's not necessarily quicker. Actually, being slow or quick depends on the how much you protect procedural rights and rights of defense. The more you protect and the more cumbersome procedure is, the slower you'll be. So the question is, you know, in this context, should we basically, you know, should we not protect the procedural rights of these digital platforms? I would say that there is, of course, the possibility to add new tools to the and, you know, make the competition enforcement more efficient. I mean, we can use interim measures more often. We can have actually shifts of the burden of proof. We can develop a broader intensity of, let's say, recognize more the discretionary power of the competition authority. So judicial review will be adapted to the problem. And to a certain extent, I would say that, you know, when we think about all these different institutional frameworks and choices, we need to be a little bit more careful in addressing, in basically creating the right mix. And of course, it's very much because maybe it's not the choice about one or the other, but maybe kind of combining basically the various frameworks, but we need to be very careful in the way we combine them so that the development of the ex-ante regulation will not kill somehow competition law enforcement in the digital sector, and will somehow, you know, enable competition authorities and digital regulators or regulators that will implement the digital ex-ante regulation to cooperate more closely. So in my view, I generally think that this is a chance also for competition law to evolve, to use different tools, different concepts, to modernize to a certain extent, to use more complex economics. And this opportunity might be missed in case we basically say, well, you know, competition law will not necessarily be the right tool. I think the proposal of having a new competition tool is a very positive one. I think there's definitely a gap in the EU context. I mean, in Greece, we have something like the new competition tool, Article 11. We haven't really used it very much so far. I mean, I'm quite keen to use it more often. But again, you know, determining the trigger of intervention in the context of the competition tool, enabling basically to develop this tool for not only the digital sector, but also non-digital sector, because ecosystem competition is not only happening within the digital sector, or the digital economy. I mean, it's happening basically everywhere. Even offline platforms are and ecosystems exist.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Ioannis.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the organization of this seminar. So what I wanted to focus on and following on what Ioannis said is on enforcement, because I think, you know, we discuss a lot about what kind of rule we need, what kind of blacklist, whitelist, and everything. But, you know, the issue of enforcement is key here, and to me, it's under-discussed, under-researched. So let me propose some avenue for enforcement. Now, we know that in digital, the enforcement will be, in the digital sector, the enforcement will be extremely complex and more complex, I think, than in another industry, for at least two reasons. One, because the asymmetry of information between the regulator and the regulatee tends to be larger. No, I mean, an asymmetry of information, there is always an asymmetry of information between the regulator and the regulatee, but I think here it tends to be larger than normally. And the second thing is, and that is partly linked to the first issue, is that we have a lot of innovation, which is very rapid and often unpredictable. So basically, you know, you have a regulator which has to arbitrate a number of trade-offs, as always, but in an environment where it has few information and an environment which is extremely unstable. So I think that makes the work of a regulator even more complicated than it is normally. Now, how then it can help this new way of enforcement, or what could be, let's say, some principle or some advice for a new way of enforcement? I think there are 4 issues that needs to be explored. And Jean Tirole has mentioned that several times, and Ioannis, you mentioned also participatory antitrust. I think that's the first principle, is that really we need there more than ever to involve everyone, the platform, the regulated platform, of course, but also all the stakeholders in the remedy design. So it cannot be, you have the remedy in the law and it is self-executing. I have a lot of doubt about any self-executing rule in that sector. But it's more about, okay, you put everyone around the table and you try to design a remedy which will work. And that could lead, for instance, to, as Ioannis mentioned, to some consent decree, like it is in the US, or some commitment like here. Now, let's be clear. When I say the regulation should be participatory, it doesn't mean self-regulation, because self-regulation, as Tirole often said, is self-serving. So here really the idea is to have a process which is steered by the regulator, but then you try to get as much information as possible. And as an example, now I didn't check that with DG.com, but I had a discussion last week with the legal counsel of DuckDuckGo, and they told me that they were not involved at all in the remedy design in the different Google case, which is a bit strange to say the least. But I mean, I said I didn't check that with DG.com whether it was true and why it was the case, but I think really this is something which should not happen in such a difficult environment. In particular, because DuckDuckGo has some idea of a good remedy, and we know that the remedy that the Commission had imposed, up to now at least, don't work very well. The second thing is experimentation. I think that regulator needs to experiment more. No, that's not easy, because you need to remain predictable, and then a court needs to accept experiment, and Bill will discuss a bit later about the court. So I realize that experimenting for a regulator, it's easier said than done. But I think really, given the lot of unknown that we still have, in particular regarding remedy, because I think we know more or less some harm, but we know very little on effective remedy. So inevitably, in a way, the regulator will have to try, will have to make mistakes. I think that's part of the game, but the point is that those mistakes are minimized. And so we'll have to experiment. Now, how it can be done? The good news is that, in fact, the online platform themselves are experimenting a lot. I mean, that's how they function. That's how they launch a new product. They launch a new product, they see how a first version, a beta version, and then they see how it works, they adapt it, and then they launch a good version. And experimentation in those industries, given the fact that you can very easily connect with user thanks to digital technology, are less expensive than before. So in a way, it's more important, the benefits are higher and the costs are lower. So clearly, I think we need to do much more ex-ante experimentation, so before the remedy is imposed. And again, I mean, to go back to the story with DuckDuckGo, they have themselves tried different way of choice architecture for a search engine. And they have tested different things, and they have some good results. I mean, some are working better than others. And again, it's a pity that this kind of information has not been used, apparently, by the Commission in designing the remedy in the Android case. So I think we have to do more ex-ante experimentation before the remedy is designed, and of course, much more ex-post analysis. No, that's not new. I mean, and Bill has called for a more ex-post analysis since a long time, and I think that's right. But still, I think authorities don't do that enough. Third element is that regulation needs to be much more data-based. Now, in France, the RCEP, this is a concept that RCEP and Sébastien Soriano in particular has developed a lot over the years. So, and I think he's right. So the idea is that the regulator should be able to collect a lot of information, diffuse a lot of information, and maybe just the only diffusion of information would already has an effect on the market. But then the question is how you process this mass of information. Because, it's all very well to say, okay, regulators should have access to many data, many information, and I think that's important, then they should be able to process all those information. And for that, I think they would need to develop a number of AI tools, like the platform themselves, who have to deal with a lot of information, a lot of AI tools to process that information. And I think from what I understand, that's what more and more the financial regulators are doing. When they have to supervise banks, they also have to deal with a lot of information. They are developing artificial intelligence to do that. And I think any digital regulator will have to do that as well. And then the fourth principle on this new way of enforcement is the enforcement could be as much as possible, when feasible, technological. So in the sense that it should be in the design of the system, in the code itself, like Lessig would have said, in the computer code, that you should have the law. So you move, you go from the legislative code to the computer code as much as possible. Now, of course, we know that it's not completely possible because code and informatic code tends to be closed, so it's black or white, while law is often gray, and that's how, in fact, lawyers make a lot of money also. And so not every law could be put into the computer, into the algorithm, but some could. And we have started with the privacy by design, which is one of the principles of the GDPR. And in fact, the European Data Protection Board has just adopted 2 weeks ago the guidelines on how to do privacy by design. So I think that could be a way. But so you see, I think, and we need to think about the rule, but we also, and it's more important, I think, to think about the enforcement. And my advice would be, the regulator should be inspired by how the platform function themselves. Learn from how the platform have improved their own operation and have become so successful. And I guess that a regulator could learn a lot from the platform they would need to regulate. Okay, this is my first some first idea that I would be happy to discuss.
I'm delighted to be here, and thanks, Filippo. Thank you so much, Florence and Janine, for putting together the panel, and for the great pleasure of being with Ioannis and Alexandre on this session today. One reason I'm especially pleased with the concept that Filippo used to design the panel is that we are talking about the institutional arrangements for putting in place bold policy initiatives. If you divide the world into physics and engineering, the physics of going to the moon was relatively straightforward. The engineering was very hard. And when I look at the grand vision in the DSA, the DMA, the DMU in the UK, the House report in the US, I see basically a declaration that says we're going to the moon. And the question for us was, how are we going to get there? That's the really hard part. And as you've already said, Filippo, if we don't think in a very hard way about that, we will have broad aspirations that are not realized in practice. And one of the key questions is, how are courts going to respond to this? And from my point of view, from an enforcement agency in the past, the key question I always had is, what do I have to tell the courts in order to persuade them to defer to my judgments on hard policy issues, to trust me, especially in the markets we're talking about that involve high levels of dynamism, a considerable degree of uncertainty, the experimentation and policymaking that Alexandre has just described, and the great complexity in this larger commercial economy that Ioannis pointed to before. Essentially, what the competition agency is doing in its choice of instruments is saying, follow me. I know where I'm going. You can trust me. And even if my path through this maze of complex, fast-changing issues may not be perfect, it's the best solution we have so far, and you should trust me to go on that journey. So how do you build this sense of confidence? And I'm not talking about legal or statutory mandates that speak about giving the margin of discretion. I'm enough of a legal realist to think that an agency gets the deference that it earns. Deference is not automatically given, it is earned. And once you persuade the court that you are a good guide and you've done your work well, it then becomes easy for the court to say, I will join you. I will trust your judgment. Let me mention 3 things that I think are critical to an agency in building that sense of trust or confidence, whether it's writing ex ante conduct standards, whether it's applying a no-fault new competition tool, whether it's applying the enhanced competition mechanism and framework that Ioannis described before. Regardless of the tool, how do I build a sense of confidence in the court that I've picked a good path? First, human capacity inside the agency. Let's look at all of our agencies and ask, especially those that are speaking most intensively about doing extensive oversight and intervention involving tech. Question 1, how many computer scientists do you have on your staff? Tell me how big your tech team is. How many of them have worked for how many years or days in the tech sector? And please don't tell me about your well-trained economists and how smart your lawyers are. I want to know how many tech people you have right now on your staff. And don't just introduce me, please, to your chief technologist. I want to meet the whole team. And if it's 1 person or 0, that's a desperately small number. And if you're going to do good work in this area, do the kind of diagnosis and prescription of treatments that we're talking about. I think it is an essential ingredient of the portfolio of human capital in the agencies that will do this work, that you have tech people to back you up and help you there. And part of that tech team has to address the concern that Alexandre just mentioned. That is, how do you collect and assimilate data based on your own experience and others' experience to assist you in doing the diagnosis and the prescription? To use a medical care analogy, how good a job does your hospital do in gathering and analyzing data within its own walls and across the hospital system as a whole to do good diagnosis, to use good surgical theater technique and good follow-up care once the operation, the treatment's been imposed? There is something in our field that could be called competition big data. That is the data based on the experience of individual agencies, across agencies. It is the experience and knowledge derived from looking at how implementation takes place. And a key frontier for greater productivity, accuracy, and effectiveness for agencies is to mine and apply that competition big data. Do you have a team inside your agency that can do this work? The Competition and Markets Authority has an exciting experiment taking place right now with the continued evolution and development of a team that's not yet a year old that's doing this kind of work. It was indispensable in doing real-time assessments of what was taking place during the COVID crisis, and now in backing up case teams and developing cases using state-of-the-art statistical analytical data analytics in case development. My prediction is that in 5 years, there will not be a major competition agency that does not have a replica or variant of this. But my minimum proposition, when you turn to the court and say, defer to me, if I'm a member of the panel, I'm going to say, who does this for you? It's going to be important to me to say, we have a lot of that capacity inside. That's guiding our judgments. We're not just talking about what a multi-sided platform is or multi-homing. We have people who know exactly what goes on inside the black box. So human capacity. Second, study and continuing consultation of the kind that Alexandre was just describing. If you're not making a major investment as an agency in ongoing research, consultations with actors outside your walls to determine what's taken place, you're going to be performing surgery using antiquated techniques that are not truly effective. You're going to be using x-rays to do diagnostic when I have an MRI instead. So are you investing in learning on an ongoing basis about what's taking place on the outside? And it's not just your own experience. And here is a frontier that's challenged. There's a lot of talk among authorities about cooperation. How good a job are you doing, especially the dozen or so agencies that profess to have a key interest in all of these policy domains, how much are you talking to each other and sharing information about what you're learning in cases, in studies, and joining that all up? In medical science, a key path for progress has been the sharing and pooling of data across a variety of healthcare systems that deal with the key questions of diagnosis, treatment, follow-up care. So what kind of study and work, what kind of investment in policy R&D are you making in your own institution? How are you joining that up with the work of others? The third element, I'm going to echo Alexandre, evaluation, evaluation, evaluation. If I go to a court, I want to tell it, I've got the right people, I've got the right information, and because I am doing experiments and I acknowledge I'm doing something new, I'm doing things that have not been done before, I'm investing a lot of effort in seeing how it's turning out. And before I initiate the project, I lay out what I expect to happen and how it's going to work. I want to know as a court, do you go back and check? How is it turning out? Do you have a commitment to test your priors with actual experience? And as a court, I don't expect you to get it right all the time. There is no shame in a miscalculation. The shame comes from repeating the same miscalculation again and again. So give me confidence that as we begin this experimental process, that you have a mechanism that replicates what good science does when it does experiments. It measures results. It experiments, it learns, it adapts. So in going to courts, I want to tell them about my human capacity. I want to tell them about how I'm getting smarter every day with my own experience and others, indeed mining competition big data. And third, I want to convince them that my aim is to get it right. And for that reason, I try to measure results and incorporate it into what I'm doing. I think that gives courts a lot more confidence to follow you on the experimental journey.
Thanks very much, Bill. And so we have roughly 40 minutes still in the panel. And so my idea is I'll kickstart with some questions, but if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A and I'll address them to the speakers as well as they come. So I wanted to start with, I think, a bit of the discussion of agency design. So there's a lot of debate going on whether, I think Ioannis said very well, this is going to stay in DigiConnect, this is going to stay in DigiComp, this is going to stay in between. And the way I read it as an outsider, no, I'm not an insider, I don't have inside information, is that this looks more like a political turf than a consideration, specific consideration on how this would impact all these capabilities that we discussed. So I wanted to ask you whether you have any particular preference on this should be focused on an antitrust authority, a new authority, and also what would be the role here for particularly in Europe, for national competition agencies? How can they help complement this ecosystem versus just being relegated to the side and being like an extra that just gives some help? So any thoughts on this would be great. And I think you can start with Ioannis, who started first.
All right, I'll just share a few things. I mean, as you know, the discussion about institutional design hasn't really happened so far. And I think it might probably start when we see the proposals in December. I mean, from my perspective, creating a new authority, and I fully agree with Bill, I mean, you have to take into account human capabilities, which are not there, I mean, in most competition authorities, but we don't see them also elsewhere. I mean, so it's a question. You need to take into account the spillover effects that, you know, creating a new authority might have on the way actually the existing authorities work and interact, and you have quite significant fixed costs, I mean, to establish a new authority. So I would say, thinking about it aloud, I mean, we could actually add an agency at the EU level, but I'm not entirely sure if an agency will do the job. And in a way, you know, creating a new institution will require some time. And as far as I understand it, the political timing is very limited. I mean, basically, the public, also the politicians, want solution now. I mean, so creating a new authority, a digital regulator, for instance, could not possibly be achieved within, let's say, a framework that could be politically acceptable. So maybe, you know, the choice that we will have is to select one of the existing institutions and to provide to these institutions the capabilities, the budget, and the mandate to do the job. And then I would say it's quite important to do a comparative institutional analysis and see what could be the side effects of providing, you know, this mandate to this existing regulator or institution as opposed to the other one. And I think this debate needs to happen at the EU level. And I think at the same time, the debate needs to happen with regards to the interaction between the EU and the national level. We have different models of interaction. We have the European Competition Network model, which works well. I mean, there are always improvements to be made, but I mean, it has worked well so far. We have actually the regulatory networks that have emerged in the telecom sector, in the energy sector. And I would say also we need to understand what could be the difficulties at each particular jurisdiction. I mean, some jurisdictions have very established and strong competition authorities, but quite weak regulatory authorities prone to capture. I think we have to be very careful in the way we select institutions at the national level, if we are actually to have a national level. I think there might be some added value in adding the national level to a certain extent, because it will take into account the specificities of the various digital ecosystems at the levels of development of each of these jurisdictions. But again, you know, this is a debate that needs to happen, and we have to do this comparative institutional analysis very seriously before finally selecting the lucky one.
Alexandre, what do you think?
Yes, so as you say, and the institution is often the thing which is decided at the end because it's the most politically sensitive issue. So, I mean, it's not surprising that it would be decided at the end. And hopefully through a physical meetings of the minister, because it will be a very difficult issue to be discussed. Now, I think you have several possibilities. It could be the national authority. And in fact, in the platform, that's what we have now. You know, it's we apply most of the time the country of origin principle, and that's what you have in the audiovisual service media directive, which is regulate video sharing platform. This is what you have in the GDPR. No, I think that will not work here because we have very, very big players, and I'm not sure that the Irish authority have a lot of capabilities or incentive, in fact, to go against Google or Facebook, which are established there. So I think the country of establishment is not a good approach for a law which is asymmetric. Maybe a good approach for a law which is symmetric, because then you have to regulate a lot of platform, but for this one is not a good one. So I think it would be better to have it at the European level. And I must say that I have been surprised of, even in the member states now, and the biggest one, there is a consensus that it needs to be, at least part of it needs to be at the European level. Then the question is, which is it a new authority or the Commission? I think, as Ioannis said, I'm not sure that, I don't think that the new authority will be in any way politically the way forward, because no one wants to have to create a new authority in Europe today. So it will probably be the Commission. Now then the question, I think there is some advantage and some disadvantage of choosing the Commission. The advantage is that it's an existing institution. So as it has been said, you don't have to create a new one. You don't have the learning cost at the beginning. And it's an institution which is used to deal with several policies. And I think here that's an important point in the institutional design, is that you have regulation, you have competition law, you have privacy and so on. And so it's good that it's a kind of multi-field or multi-framework, legal framework institution. The disadvantage, however, I see is that ideally, I think it should be an independent institution, and the Commission is supposed to be independent of the member states, but it's not independent of many other things. And in fact, the president of the commission says that I want a geopolitical commission. So I mean, clearly here, if you know, you use the regulation geopolitically, it may be at least it may be raise some question. So I think we will end up with the commission. Then the next question with the pro and the con. The next question is how it will be organized within the commission. And Ioannis mentioned the report by Ruprecht. But I think you know, the commission could cooperate, and in fact in telecom that's what they have done. I mean, they have set up joint team between Comp and DG Comp and DG Connect. So I think it can work very well. Yet, and to finish, I think you may have a role for national authority first, in the sense of to receive complaint, because you know, if you are a small app developer and you have a problem with a big ecosystem platform, you probably it's easier for you to complain before a national authority than to go to the commissions. That's the first thing, and the second thing is indeed you may have some national platform which are a national gatekeeper, and therefore for that I think a national authority would be better. Now, the question is which authority? Should it be the antitrust authority? Should it be the telecom authority? Should it be something else? I personally think the most cautious choice of the European legislator would say every country has to have a national digital authority, an NDA. And it's up to each member state, according to its institutional autonomy, to decide which authority it will be. The only thing is that EU law may decide or may impose the feature of that national digital authority. So it should be independent, it should be well resources, and all those kind of stuff. But I think it would be wiser that it's the choice of which authority it is, an existing one, a new one, a network of existing one, should be left to the member states.
Thanks a lot. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a huge literature about what the menu of choices looks like, and we've already identified a number of them. I find it a bit mortifying that these issues have not been front and center of the discussion about what the larger new regulatory commands ought to be. That is, I have the uneasy sense that this is an afterthought, that we're going to make commands whose design, I think, in many ways depends on what the framework's going to be for implementation. And we're saying, we'll get to that later. It's like the instructor in the classroom, it gets a tough question from the student and you say, oh, we'll get to that later. Well, we're here right now. And this should have been picked up from the start. Maybe not with definitive answers, but I don't see how you can think about what you want the system to do without thinking about this from the front. So here we are, it's later. It's now what to do. A couple of ways to think about this. One is identify in the comparative way that Ioannis was talking about before. Is there a regulatory model or framework somewhere out there on the planet that you like? That is, what are your top three? If you're going to design something new, what are the three best new regulatory mechanisms created, say, in the last 10 years from the ground up? Are we going to study the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the United States, which was a startup set in motion in 2010 that had a mix of ex-ante rulemaking, ex-post traditional law enforcement, broad data collection responsibilities, plus a command to publish reports, and an extraordinary generous initial budget to do all these things. So do you like the CFPB first, to take one example? Is that going to be your model? With an architecture and design that assigned roles to individual member states as well, to create a hub and spoke framework. So do you like that? Are you going to give it to some institution that exists now? How do you like the experience of the ASAM in the Netherlands, which is a multifunction regulatory institution? How do you like the experience in Spain with a policy conglomerate that has a wide array of different functions put together? That is, within the framework of European experience, is there an example of the multifunction, multi-tool regulatory institution that you find worth thinking about? All of these, by the way, involve integration by ownership as opposed to contract. That is, bring it all into one institution. And there are foreign models of the multi-function, multi-tool institution as well. Another approach is, where are the best experience in Europe with what might be called policy integration by contract? This is part of what Alexandre was referring to before. That is, you have an institution that, say, has a lead role, but instead of bringing functions directly under its own authority, you ask it to form synapses, contracts with other institutions that work collaboratively to establish the mechanism for implementation and policy direction. And that can take place at the community level, but also a collaborative relationship with member state institutions too. So by contract, not by ownership, you have a lead institution in the EU working collaboratively with other EU bodies and directorates, but also at the same time with the infrastructure of enforcement and policymaking at the member state level as well. And there again, I think you start by saying, where have we done this well? Is it competition law with COMP working with the other directorates and through the ECN with the member states? Is there something out there that we like now that we want to work with and build on in the future? And in looking at the concrete examples, I think it tells you a lot about specific implementation difficulties you're going to face and how perhaps to overcome them. So I think if I were going about thinking how to do this, I want to look at what we've done already that seems to have the best promise to build out on. And that could include creating something new. And I want to look at those models, assigning a certain function to an existing institution. Footnote, that's the struggle that's going on in the UK right now. Where does the digital markets unit go? Furman, in effect, left out a big issue on its exam paper. That is, if I were grading Furman, I'd say, where did you answer the question of where this goes? And they'd say, we'll get to that later. Or at the bottom of the exam, you write time. In this instance, they're still dealing with that. Is it going to go to the CMA? Is it going to go to Ofcom? Is it going to go someplace else? Big, difficult question. But I think in many ways, you look at your experience with other institutional arrangements you've made, and in context, in Europe, you have a good judgment about what's going to work most effectively, with a commitment periodically to come back and say, are we happy with that? Do we want to create something else?
Thanks. I think this is all very enlightening. And coming from the Stigler Center and discussing regulation, I have to ask a question about capture. But I think in this particular area, we really did see from the House report a general conclusion that the FTC and the DOJ did a horrible job in overseeing, partly because you're very close to maybe the Obama administration and things like these. And now when you're talking about the creation of the super regulator, I want to hear from you, what makes you believe that a EU system would be less prone to capture than a potential US system? And if you believe that, why? And I don't mean only capture by the industry, not only capture by like Google and Facebook influencing the regulator, but why makes us believe that this regulator will not be defending, I don't know, the interest of Spotify versus the interest of EU consumers, for example. So there's a lot of talk about in this new Digital Services Act about independence, strategic independence, and creating European platforms. So I was wondering, what are these trade-offs in the allocation of powers and the creation of regulation versus antitrust? How do you see this particular issue of capture playing out? And I think you can start with Alexandre now to rotate a bit, and then we go to, and then next.
I mean, the risk of capture is always there. So the question is how you try to minimize that risk with your institutional design. And that was part of my point, that by giving it to the Commission, which is a political body and wants to be more and more a political body, you may have a risk of capture, not necessarily by the industry, but by by politician who says, okay, now we have to go against platform because, I mean, it's unbelievable how the climate has changed in 3 years. 3 years ago they were the God, now they are the devil. I mean, I think it was excessive then, it is excessive now. And so I think it would be better to have an independent authority. And this is an old debate, whether DGCOM in fact should be left out of the Commission and you should create a kind of an independent DGCOM. But I think this issue of and this power that the Commission may get will bring back this issue in a way. And if you think about it, the only regulator that we have at the European level, that is the SSM, the Single Supervision Mechanism for the biggest bank of Europe, the systemic bank. And that is at the ECB, that is not at the Commission. So I think that realistically, it will be the Commission which will be in charge of the DMA, because that's how I sense the political environment now. But I think that the risk of capture, as you say, is probably higher than it will be an independent authority. So we will have an issue there. So the way to solve it then is through a strict judicial review. Now, as we know, in Europe, at least up to now, the review of the court, at least of the Court of Justice, the Supreme Court, maybe less from the General Court, has been relatively lenient to the Commission, because, I mean, they see themselves as the Commission and the Court as an actor of the European project. So I understand that, and this is a project in the making, which is made through law. Okay, so in a way, in general, the Court has been relatively supportive to what the Commission is doing for a political reason, I think, and for a good reason. But that leads us to a judicial review system which is much less strict than what you have in the US or in the UK, for instance. So, you know, with an institution which is not independent and a judicial review system which is relatively weak, there is, I think, some worry to have. And so we have to think about that. I think possibly through a stricter rule or through a stricter judicial review in that case.
Bill, what do you think?
I think we could have a wonderful conversation about exactly what we mean by capture and precisely how it operates and to what degree specific institutions already are subject to it. I think that's a very valuable topic for further exploration. I just say that you know, how do you have larger assurance in society that the choices taken are generally in the path of a greater social interest and not in the interest of individual interest groups in a way that diverge from that larger social interest? How do you do that? One path you take is you have meaningful disclosure of policy choices made and the rationale for the policy choices. That is, on a regular basis, you require agencies to account for the choices they made. Now, there's a real tension here, though, isn't there? That is, we've talked already about how we want autonomy, but at the same time, there's a concern about accountability, as well as a concern about effectiveness. These are trade-offs, and I suspect that one thing that you would press the autonomous agency to be is to be more fully informative about choices taken, and you build in this element of assessment after the fact, where you have outside observers taking a look at what happened and seeking to reconstruct the decision-making process to see what accounted for the decisions made. I realize that takes place after the fact, but if you know as a regulator, and you're aware that there's going to be this process of reckoning and accounting after the fact, it probably makes you perhaps somewhat more attuned to the considerations you should be taking into account in making the judgments that you're making. You know, should the courts, in some sense, ratchet up the degree of scrutiny? I suppose that is a basic safeguard, but there's a tension here too, isn't there, with their idea that there has to be experimentation, that agencies have to engage in some degree of risk-taking, doing something new. So is the court going to bear down on them and say, you didn't quite do that right, I'm not convinced that was the right way to do it? Or are they going to say, I realize that in this difficult area, you need some latitude to test. There's going to be a real tension there as well. On a system-wide basis, I'd simply suggest that periodically you want to go back and ask, how is the system functioning? Are we happy with the way these parts and instruments are actually performing? That kind of assessment has taken place for the ECN. It's taken place in a number of areas of policymaking. I suspect to calibrate things in a way we've been suggesting here to deal with the tension between autonomy, political accountability, footnote capture, and effectiveness, we have to come back on this issue periodically and ask from a system-wide basis, how do we like it? And do parliamentarians or legislators recognize this? No. The House Majority Staff Report that we referred to is at a basic level deliciously hypocritical in that it does not recognize the extent to which Congress has been the conduit for capture. Congress has been the source in so many instances of the political pressure that happens at the behest of affected interests. So we had the House Majority appoint basically talking about how agencies have to bear down and do a better job and not be captured. Yet while they are one of the main facilitators of capture, I would have liked to have heard more from them about what they're going to do to impose some discipline on their own intervention.
Thanks a lot, Ioannis. What do you think, being a regulator now? So we have the power of the pen.
All right. So I'll just say a few words about capture, but I would like to come up to the institutional choice because I think it's a very important and not well-examined issue. I think risk of capture is one of the parameters we have to take into account, as well as what Bill said before, human capabilities, technological, et cetera. Obviously, to me, I mean, it sounds like a regulator that will deal with 5 mega firms has a higher risk of capture than someone that will actually deal with thousands of firms that have actually conflicting interests. I mean, it's a very simple, maybe some will consider as a simplistic conclusion, but actually, you know, I think the risk is higher. That said, and also it raises a question about, you know, because what we define as now the big 5 might change in the future. I mean, this is an area that really develops and changes very quickly. The development of quantum computing, IoT, etc., might change completely in a few years' time. The choke points actually that we're liking, the gatekeepers, if you like this term more. And I think it's definitely a problem of design there, and how you're going to manage to ensure that this regulation will not be used by these regulated companies to impede these changes and these technological developments. For me, it's a big question. Now, I think the EU level is definitely the best level to regulate because of the sheer magnitude of these companies and the global, basically, these are global players. And there, you know, we have already a decentralized framework with a platform to business regulation that has been now implemented. Actually, in Greece, it was implemented a couple of days ago. And of course, institutional choices made for the platform to business regulation, we'll have to check and see, you know, I mean, it could be quite interesting study because, you know, in some jurisdictions, I mean, they have already selected some public authority on top of, you know, the existing framework that is set by the platform of business regulation. They went a bit further, so we'll have to see that. Now, I guess because we have a decentralized framework, it makes sense to have a centralized one. So it should be done at the Commission level, and I think there needs to be some form of arrangement between the various departments of the Commission. I mean, I can understand Alexandre's concern about the geopolitical kind of issue, and the fact, you know, that this is done in the context of the discussion about industrial policy, European industrial policy. But at the same time, you know, this is something that we could probably tackle within the way actually the various players, DG Comp and DG Connect, etc., could interact. I think there's always a risk of creating something new because it will take time. You might get it really wrong, etc. So I think it's better to right now choose and select existing players. Now, if we make the choice to go also to the national level, I will not be in agreement with Alexandre that we need to leave the choice to the member states. I think the current system might present problems in the sense that we might face the issue that some member states might make very bad choices. And the Commission, what they're trying to do is to ensure that there's no digital divide. I mean, every European citizen should have equal capabilities to and companies to use basically to be a player in the digital economy. And I think, you know, the Commission should have a much more hands-on approach. Should have a much more hands-on approach in the choice of the regulator firm. I think it would be a disaster if you leave that choice to member states, because it will create somehow very a lot of difficult and complex interactions. Now, Bill said that, well, we have the choice of the multi-task authority, and I think it could be an interesting model to possibly think about. Secondly, if we choose to have, a regulator, this regulator will have to somehow cooperate with the competition authority, because the regulation we're talking about is a competition regulation. I mean, basically the do's and the don'ts are, you can very easily consider these are per se some kind of anti-competitive conduct. I mean, I don't even see why we should have this as a separate list. I mean, a code of conduct which could be imposed by a competition authority decision will achieve exactly the same result. I think but that's my personal view, I think is wrong to have this conception of something very different. I think it could be done by a competition law enforcer, actually, the same thing, and it could actually be considered as per se legal conduct. And we could deal with that under competition law. But in any way, if you do that, I mean, you have to make sure that there is an interaction between and cooperation between the regulator that will be the national digital regulator and the national competition authority. And I can say, because I mean, from experience the last year, that is really a lot of hard work to establish a system that works in the context of the interaction between regulators and competition authorities. I mean, in a field which is new and where there's a lot of gray area of what each of us could do. I mean, this is really there's a lot of room for competition between them. Who is going to get basically the juicy part of the digital economy, which is also, I think, very good. I mean, because you do interesting stuff. You deal with companies that are global, etc. So, and I think that the risk of having not a very clear, framework in terms of competence might be that you have somehow infights between the national digital regulator and the national competition authorities, and that's not something which we should have. So, and then once you define very clearly the areas of competence, then you have to create some framework, like a network, like the UK has, to enable them to cooperate together. But again, that cannot work unless you have very clear delimitation of competences, and that's very hard to do in this context, because as I said, this is not really about only digital platforms. I mean, many platforms like Airbnb could not be considered as digital, because I mean, they have a digital part, and they also have actually a part which is non-digital. So in a way, a lot of platforms are hybrid. It's very hard to say this is digital fully. And I think that could be a really big problem, I have to say. And I think the final thing I want to say is, why don't we, we see competition authorities are developing, they're doing their best to develop new capabilities. Market mapping is one of the new things that competition authorities are doing more and more, in particular now with COVID-19. And that really shows the development of a competition authority to something more than just, we have a complaint and they are basically in the process of mapping markets and monitoring markets in order to, somehow learn and develop their priorities. And I think, this is a quite interesting development. And in a couple of years, with the development of, computational economics and computational antitrust, we might actually see capabilities developing that we don't have right now.
I think I have some questions from the audience that I'd like to pose to you, because they're also interesting. And then I'll pose two questions, and then we can decide that we have some 8 minutes left, so we can answer quickly. One question from MC Shamas is asking whether the sandboxing process that we are having is growing a lot in fintech can be a good idea for how you do experimentation in terms of remedies. And then a second question by Oles Andrich is directed to you, but I think everyone can answer is, how do you avoid having a system where it's a mouse trying to catch a tiger? No, you have these smaller regulators trying to go after these gigantic companies. And I think it's very interesting to tie this. If you think that there was a very interesting report by Brave showing how pretty much no European data protection authority actually has data personnel, exactly because they're like the most expensive people to hire. So except for the UK that actually charges fees from the the players in the market, no one else has the resources or has the capabilities of hiring you. So how would you think about developing these capabilities, in particular into independent funding, things like this, in particular for smaller NCAs? And I think now, Bill, we can start with you, and then let's go quickly so we can hear from everyone.
I think the sandbox is a regulatory experiment of the kind that Alexandre was referring to before, and I think that in general terms, I find it very attractive as a way of testing new approaches. I think the key thing for all of us is to see how those approaches are turning out. That is, what kind of outcomes are they generating? Are we happy with the results? The life cycle we see with experimentation techniques is people say, should government be innovative, creative, bold? Yes, 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 until somebody makes a mistake. Then we have a search for the guilty and ruthless punishment for people who made a mistake. So as societies, we tend to love experimentation until it fails, but that's not how you achieve good results. So I think there will be here room for a number of different regulatory experiments. It puts a premium on our efforts to try and identify what's working and what isn't. On mice trying to catch tigers, I go back to my earlier comment that if you're not going to properly staff the institutions in question, if you're not going to have the right team to do the work, you're going to have a yawning gap between commitments and capabilities, and that shows up in the eyes of citizens as a great performance deficiency. So if we want to do this well, if we want to go to the moon, which apparently we say we want to do, it's going to cost. We're going to have to pay for it, and we can't do it on the cheap. Now, I would say it's worth doing, but it won't be cheap. So if we create frameworks that have exalted expectations, but very modest abilities to deliver, we're going to be further behind than we were when we began.
Thanks, Ioannis. What are your thoughts on this point?
Let's say very quickly some thoughts about the issue of the mice going for the tiger. I mean, that's also one of the reasons that I think doing that at the EU level might be the most appropriate, because we can put actually the money and the capabilities and be able to have a result. If we select to do that at the national level, I think there it's going to be quite hard for national competition authorities, with the exception probably one or two, or national digital authorities, to go after these major platforms. I think in this case we might even consider possibilities of developing consortia of NDAs or NCAs, or NDAs and NCAs together from different member states. That could possibly, cooperate and the common actions. And we have actually the examples of the Booking.com and Expedia cases in Europe, where a number of European NCAs with 3 leaders have basically managed to get commitments, and European-wide commitments. So I think that's possibly a model that we can develop in the future. But I think again, I agree with Bill. Creating an institutional structure and providing member states that do not have the capabilities even now to somehow provide the staff and the budget to the existing national competition authorities and regulatory authorities, and tell them, oh well, you have to create something extra. I think that's going to be quite problematic, and I'm not sure it will work.
Perfect. Thank you, Alexandre. The final words of the panel. You can close it with final thoughts.
Yes, thank you. On the sandboxing idea, I think, yes, it's part of the family of experimentation, but as I understand the sandboxing, which is done with the fintech and in particular by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, it's more when a new player, and general small player, has a good idea, and they don't want to be subject to too much regulation, because otherwise regulation will impede that product. They have the possibility to do it with a kind of regulatory waiver and see how it works. I think here the situation is a bit different, because it's not that we want to waive regulation, it's just that we want to design the remedy in the best way. So I'm more thinking about this A/B testing that the company are doing themselves, and the regulator to maybe instruct the company to do this A/B testing and then report to the authority to decide how it works. So it's part of the same family, but I'm not sure that the sandboxing as it is practiced by the FCA could be transposed here, because the situation is a bit different. I mean, whether it can work to have a regulatory authority in that sector when you have those very big players. I mean, of course, you may say it will not work, so we leave it to the market, but I'm not sure that it's the best way to go. And the alternative is to say, okay, how we design it. So clearly it should be at the European level, they should be well staffed, and I think they should have a lot of sanctioning power. So they should have the nuclear bump in their possibility of, for instance, imposing structural separation or prohibiting all advertising on a platform, not to be used like a nuclear bomb, but to have a meaningful negotiation with the platform. But at the end of the day, I think what we need to have is a kind of a new deal, new digital deal between the European authorities and the big platform on the way forward. I really think, and I think Breton is a bit in this mind, and I think that's positive, to have a kind of, they should work together around of what could be a good digital deal for Europe. And if they don't play by the rule, then they will be sanctioned very, very heavily. But first, try to have this deal.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the three of you for a terrific panel. I think it was a very refreshing and new approach to the discussion.